For a very special reason, I requested the ability to do the reading today. I wish to share some insights from a blind visionary who has declared that the only thing worse than being blind is lacking vision. Being blind is having sight but lacking vision. Please indulge me while I take a little longer to expand your perception of possibility. In February, I requested the summer solstice for my main message. However, June 21 was reserved for Father's Day, so I chose the 28th instead. By this time, I had also conceived the idea to expand this reading into a tribute, and wondered whether a date coinciding with the author's birthday would be more fitting. This is what I learned about letting God. On June 27, 1880, Helen Adams Keller was born with 5 healthy senses. She spoke her first words at 6 months and took her first steps at 1 year. Before losing vision and hearing to illness at 19 months. Despite Helen's sensory challenges, Ann Sullivan taught her language by fingerspelling words into her open palm. In addition to Braille, Helen became proficient in 5 languages and authored 12 books and wrote 475 speeches and essays before her death. Beginning with Helen's mental awakening, this tribute includes edited excerpts from her spiritual memoir, Light in My Darkness. For nearly 6 years, I had no concepts of nature or mind or God or death. I literally thought with my body. Without a single exception, my memories of that time are tactile. I know that I was impelled like an animal to seek food and warmth. I remember crying, but not the grief that caused the tears. I kicked, and because I recall it physically, I know that I was angry. I imitated those about me when I made signs for things that I wanted. I was like an unconscious clod of earth. There was nothing in me except the instinct to eat and drink and sleep. My days were a blank, without past, present, or future, without hope or anticipation, without interest or joy. Then suddenly I knew not how or where or when, my brain felt the impact of another mind, and I awoke to language, to knowledge, to love, to the usual concepts of nature, good and evil. I was actually lifted from nothingness to human life. During the next 8 years, Helen strove to understand the relationship between nature and the Creator. As a child, I naturally wanted to know who made everything in the world, and I was told that Mother Nature had made earth and sky and water and all living things. This satisfied me for a time, and I was happy among the rose trees in my mother's garden and on the bank of a river. Like other children, I believed that every object that I touched was alive and self-conscious. Somehow I sensed that nature was no more concerned about me or those that I loved than with a twig or a fly. This awoke in me something akin to resentment. Turning away from nature, I inquired about God. Friends tried to tell me that God was the Creator and that He was everywhere and that He knew all the needs and joys and sorrows of every human life. That nothing happened without His foreknowledge and providence. Some with generous dispositions said that God was merciful to all and caused the sun to shine on the just and the unjust alike. I was drawn irresistibly to such a glorious, lovable being, and I longed really to understand something about him. But I could not form any clear idea of the relationship between this divine love and the material world. I lost myself many times in shadows and uncertainties, wandering back and forth between the light that was ineffably reassuring and the chaos and darkness of nature that seemed so real as not to be denied. Around the age of 14 years, Helen's spiritual awakening occurred while sitting in the library. I turned to my teacher and said, "Such a strange thing has happened. I have been far away all this time and I haven't left the room." "What do you mean, Helen?" Ann asked, surprised. "Why, I have been in Athens." Scarcely were the words out of my mouth when a bright, amazing realization seemed to catch my mind and set it ablaze. I perceived the realness of my soul and its sheer independence of all conditions of place and body. It was clear to me that it was because I was spirit that I had so vividly seen and felt a place thousands of miles away. Space was nothing to spirit. In that new consciousness shone the presence of God, who is a spirit everywhere at once, the Creator dwelling in all the universe simultaneously. Helen's spiritual education blossomed through her friendship with John Hitz, an associate of Alexander Graham Bell. Until his death, John spent 6 weeks of every summer with Helen and Ann. Helen writes, "He loved to take me out walking early in the morning while the dew was upon the grass. We would often pause that I might feel the swaying of the trees, the bending of the flowers, and the waving of the corn. And he would say, 'The wind that puts all of this life into nature is a marvelous symbol of the Spirit of God.'" John also introduced Helen to the philosophy of Emanuel Swedenborg, 18th century Swedish theologian and mystic whose inspiration would illuminate her life into meaningful service. Helen's IQ is commonly estimated to have been around 160. On this date in 1904, one day after her 24th birthday, Helen graduated with honors from Radcliffe College. As a native of Alabama, she advocated for the rights of Black people during the early days of the NAACP and was a lifelong advocate for the needs and rights of women and people with disabilities. In 1920, she was co-founder of the ACLU. As Goodwill Ambassador, she traveled to nearly 40 countries and campaigned for world peace. In 1955, to recognize her life as advocate, activist, and author, Harvard University awarded Helen with a Doctor of Laws degree. Moreover, she was invited to the White House of every president, from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon Johnson. In 1980, to mark her 100th birthday, Jimmy Carter authorized the federal observance of Helen Keller Day on June 27. This tribute is incomplete without a glimpse into the life of Ann Sullivan. When Ann was 5 years old, she was left partially blind by illness, unable to read or write. She later attended the Perkins School for the Blind, where her vision was partially restored through surgery. At the time of her death in 1936, after 50 years as Helen's teacher and companion, Ann Sullivan Macy was completely blind. Helen Keller's life was far more complex than can be simply shared in this tribute. At the risk of seeming dismissive of the tremendous personal cost behind her extraordinary achievements, I've highlighted her successes with a limited glimpse into the effort and assistance that ensured those achievements. Therefore, this tribute continues in the narrative of my message today, Blinded by the Light. Seth, the entity channeled by Jane Roberts, has this to say about perception. The physical senses allow you to perceive the three-dimensional world, and yet by their very nature can inhibit the perception of other equally valid dimensions. Helen Keller writes, "As I wander through the dark, encountering difficulties, I'm aware of encouraging voices that murmur from the spirit realm." In this message, I explore spiritual encounters beyond physical perception. So naturally, that's where I begin. While nerve cells finish their development, the healthy eyes of infants see primarily in black, white, and shades of gray, with focal distance limited to 10 inches. By 5 months, most infants have developed full color 20/20 vision. In premature infants, the lack of retinal development is called retinopathy of prematurity, a condition often aggravated by bright lights. Throughout the 1940s and early 50s, such infants were subjected to high concentrations of oxygen in airlock incubators. Retrolental fibroplasia was a related condition in which excess oxygen caused the abnormal growth of blood vessels behind the lens. Musician Stevie Wonder was one of approximately 10,000 infants impacted by this epidemic of blindness. Vicky Umapeg Noratuk was born in 1950 at just 22 weeks and states that she had never understood the concept of light. Her story first appears in 1997 in the Journal of Near-Death Studies. In an article entitled Near-Death and Out-of-Body Experiences in the Blind, a study of apparent eyeless vision, Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper interview 31 respondents. The following synopsis of Vicky's experiences is culled from multiple interviews since 1996. The Ring-Cooper study mentions Vicky's first near-death experience. In 1963, when she's 12 years old, extremely sick in the ICU. In a later interview, she states that she just saw Jesus, who instructs her to return to her grieving mother. This and her subsequent NDE don't begin to make sense until after the publication in 1975 of Life After Life by Raymond Moody. In 1973, 21-year-old Vicky is working as a singer in a Seattle nightclub. One evening, she accepts a ride with some inebriated patrons. She remembers the crash that throws her from the vehicle and the 300-pound woman who lands on top of her, compounding injuries to her head, neck, back, and leg. As the only person injured in the crash, Vicky later learns that had she hit her head a half-inch lower, she wouldn't have survived. Vicky describes her experience with her etheric body while still at the scene. It had form, with head, arms, and legs. It was everything that was me. All of my memories, my consciousness, everything. And it kept going in and out of my mouth. The etheric body is surrounded by an egg-shaped field anchored through a central channel in the spine and penetrating the physical form. As her etheric body hovers indecisively above the street, Vicky is terrified by the sudden shift in sensory data. A lot of people would ask me, well, wasn't it wonderful to be able to see? No, it was horrible, and I wouldn't have wished it on my worst enemy. She doesn't remember the ambulance ride, but afterward finds herself completely out of body, observing her medical team from the hospital ceiling. She thinks, well, that's weird. What am I doing up here? Only after recognizing her hair and her distinctive wedding ring is she able to identify the body as her own. She then thinks, well, that body must be me. Am I dead? Ring and Cooper affirm that the NDE narratives of blind people tend to be indistinguishable from those of sighted people. Unable to communicate her well-being, Vicky travels up through the hospital until she's again above the street. As she's reveling in her freedom, a vehicle forms around her, an apparent expansion of her etheric body as a mode of transportation. In ancient Jewish mysticism, the Merkaba is a counter-rotating field of light energy that transports the soul to higher consciousness. In modern sacred geometry, however, the Merkaba is a three-dimensional eight-pointed star comprising interlocking tetrahedrons with one pointing toward the heaven and the other pointing toward earth. The two-dimensional Star of David further embodies the wisdom of as above, so below. Vicky says, there were people ahead of me and behind me, but I was alone in my particular conveyance. Reclining, she's able to peer through the apertures as her vehicle travels at tremendous speed. Then she says, I went past hell. I heard it and I smelled it. The odor reminds Vicky of the sulfur that friends brought back from the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. That same odor took 3 days to wash off her hands. After declaring that she wants no part of hell, Vicky accelerates toward her destination. Alex Ferrari of Next Level Soul podcast states that 5% of souls who experience hell in their NDEs need only to choose differently, to instead call upon God or ascended masters according to faith, a confirmation that hell is simply an optional state of mind. Vicky arrives at a park-like shelter surrounded by huge flowers and beautiful music. Ejected in the presence of Jesus, she's prevented from moving beyond the gate. Instead, she must return to give birth to her children. Now 75 years old and widowed for a second time, Vicky has 3 living children by her first marriage and 7 stepchildren by her second marriage. Jesus also instructs her to learn and to teach about loving and forgiving, and says to tell them that I am. In 1973, Vicky is unfamiliar with this declaration in Mark 14:62. The importance of religion among blind people can't be overstated. I cannot imagine myself living without religion, says Helen Keller. I could as easily fancy a living body without a heart. To one who is deaf and blind, the spiritual world offers no difficulty. Nearly everything in the natural world is as vague, as remote from my senses as spiritual things seem to be in the minds of most people. But the inner or mystic sense, if you will, gives me vision of the unseen. In addition to her second encounter with Jesus, Vicky is greeted by significant people in her life and readily recognizes her classmates, 2 cognitively challenged blind girls who in this environment are in the prime of their existence. Everything was prime in that place. The weather, the flowers, the birds, just perfect. Vicky says that these girls are the best of every age. Accordingly, they have a childlike spirituality, childlike quality for having been children. They're also middle-aged and have the wisdom of the very old. In Sylvia Brown's books about the afterlife, this ideal soul projection is 30 years old. Likewise, Luke 3:23 states that Jesus is 30 years old when he begins his ministry. In Vicky's words, every encountered soul vibrates at a different rate that all have different brilliances and brightnesses. Vicky also is met by both maternal grandparents and learns that her grandfather, who had transitioned just prior to her birth, had appeared to her pregnant mother. Don't worry, you're going to have a little girl and she'll live. At birth, Vicky weighed just 3 pounds, later dropping below 2 pounds. Vicky's grandmother, despite a diagnosis of high-functioning psychosis, had raised Vicky in an abusive environment before her own transition in 1971. Although grateful for her mother's care, Vicky has also struggled with depression and thoughts of suicide. Vicky argues with Jesus about returning to her broken body. Before sending her back, Jesus shows Vicky her life review. She experiences the overwhelming emotion of her grandmother's mental illness, for which she feels gut-wrenching compassion. This experience helps Vicky to heal from the associated trauma. Vicky learns that she was clinically dead for 4 minutes. In the early 70s, there was little to no recognition of NDEs. When Vicky shares her experience at the hospital, one nurse says, "You must have hit your head harder than we thought." Vicky then stops speaking about her experience until her interview in 1996. Without the benefit of physical sight, it's a full year before Vicky can stand without fainting. The NDE of Brad Barrows also figures prominently in the Ring Cooper study. Brad is 8 years old in 1968 when he contracts a severe case of pneumonia while living at the Boston Center for Blind Children. His heart stops for 4 minutes, after which he is revived through CPR. During his NDE, Brad travels upward and briefly sees his blind roommate leave to get help for someone occupying the other bed, not immediately recognizing that someone as himself. Once through the roof, Brad observes the slow movement of traffic next to the building and is puzzled by his perception of movement without the benefit of sound. He continues to rise into a dark, whirling tunnel, which narrows as he moves through it. Brad just knows that there's an open meadow ahead, and as it comes into view, he sees very tall trees and lush grass. Light is not only shining at him, but emanating from him, as though he were totally bathed in it. He describes the light as both extremely bright whiteness and brilliant color. He has the impression that if he were to experience this light on the earthly plane, it would be far more than he could withstand. While researching this topic, I was especially interested in the anecdotes shared by viewers, as Keith compares Brad's experience to her own brief but impactful dream. "All I saw was light beaming out of me. Before waking up, she wonders whether this is the light of Christ." Central to Mormon doctrine, the light of Christ is an all-encompassing divine power and intelligence that fills the immensity of space and gives life to all things. Another viewer, Peta C., slowly losing her sight to progressive disease, describes a vision about the coming of Jesus Christ. She sees a distant light through her window, growing larger and brighter, and thinks, "If this light grows any brighter, it will completely blind me." Drawing from an earlier talk, I reiterate the words of Jesus in the Essene Gospel of Peace. "When you can gaze upon the noonday sun with unflinching eyes, you can then look upon the blinding light of your heavenly Father, which is 1,000 times brighter than 1,000 suns." Yet we're assured by many revived souls that non-physical eyes have no difficulty gazing upon this vast ocean of loving energy. What could be more blissful than immersion in the creative light of the universe? Indeed, Peta describes this light as overwhelming, intangible love that completely engulfs her, like water when diving into a pool. Remembering her own experience, Kathleen J. likens this immersion to a bucket of love being poured over her. When she questions God about it, he says, "Shh, let me love you." Kathleen says, "Thinking about it brings tears to my eyes." Brad then begins to hear the singing of thousands of voices as he moves rapidly up the steep side of a very high mountain until he reaches an archway comprising many indescribable colors. Likewise, Mary describes an experience following the death of her husband. While out walking, she suddenly finds herself in a spirit body of pure, translucent light in procession to God's holy city of David atop Mount Zion. She describes each blade of the emerald grass in an attitude of worship, the whole as a blanket of a great symphony. One viewer wonders how Brad could know what he's seeing. Likewise, Natalie is amazed by adult Brad's choice of words, such as angle or aspect, presuming that a blind person would find such ideas difficult to ascertain. Consider Helen Keller's admonition. Sighted people imagine that blind people are cut out from all beauty of color, music, and shape. They need to understand that the elements of beauty, order, form, and proportion are tangible to the blind, and that beauty and rhythm are the result of a spiritual law deeper than sense. Seth explains that our inner senses perceive other realities and operate whether or not we have physical form. Nevertheless, Helen says, if I employed my mystic sense constantly without trying to understand the outside world, my progress would be checked and everything would fall into chaos. It is easy for me to mix up the spiritual and the physical, which I have not properly visualized. Without discernment, I could not keep them apart. So even if I commit errors in forming concepts of color, sound, light, and intangible phenomena, I must always try to preserve equilibrium between my outer and my inner worlds. Neither can I use my sense of touch without reference to the experience of others. Without the help of those who see, I would go astray or go round and round in a blind circle. Brad then notices a figure, perhaps an angel, which he estimates to be around 9 feet tall. The angel communicates that he can't stay. Why not? Asks 8-year-old Brad. I like it here. The angel explains that if Brad were to allow his love to permeate his life, he would see this place again. But for now, he must fulfill his mission. As Brad is processing these words, he finds himself back on his bed. Shortly before death, and often lasting minutes to hours, terminal lucidity is the temporary return of mental clarity, memory, and coherent speech in patients with dementia, brain injuries, and psychiatric disorders. Perhaps this definition should be expanded to include the pre-death visions of the physically blind. Tom explains that his friend's physical eyes, like Helen Keller's, had been replaced. In his 60s, Tom's friend is in the hospital with cancer. Moments before he transitions, he turns his face toward his wife as she's entering the room and says, "You're wearing the same green dress that you wore yesterday." Then, turning his face upward, he says that he can see the fluorescent light above his bed. In a nod to Father's Day, John Paul states that his father had been blind during the last 12 years of his life. 2 months before his transition, his father shares many dreams in which he sees his deceased family. His father also loved to play guitar, and the last song was Father and Son by Cat Stevens, with the final words, "I know I have to go." Helen Keller believed that death is no more than passing from one room into another, saying, "But there's a difference for me, you know, because in the other room I shall be able to see." On June 1, 1968, Helen passed from this room into the next, leading the world beyond the limits of physical vision. So it is. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't help. What's that? Yeah. we've been told that the QCC food is for those who attend, but in honor of Helen's birthday, we have purchased a cake that everybody is welcome to enjoy. I'm sorry that this went over. I really strove so hard to keep it within the time limit, but it was a massive effort.